Lecture Series Committee, Sean Burns, Carla Corbin, Meg Calkins, Scott Truax, Dave Ferguson, thank you. Malcolm Carnes for the exhibits, thank you. Nina Davis, the meatballs were Nina's, by the way. Carrie Mashevitz, Helen Turner, Chris Helms, thanks for all your work. And finally, a special thanks to Professor Kevin Klinger for helping to bring our special guest here today. So Professor Klinger, would you do the honors of the introduction?
Thank you so much, Phil. Conversations matter. Todd Williams, Billie Tsien Architects Partners are located in New York City, and their studio focuses on organizations and people who value issues of aspiration and meaning, timelessness and beauty. Conversations matter. Our task is to create the physical world, to translate ideas into form and space and light and material, and inhabit and to experience these built realities. Question to Billie: how do you communicate your intentions for a presidential library? Answer: how do you represent values? Olin, can I get a witness? Conversations matter. I miss the days in architecture lectures where we used to do dual projectors to show two simultaneous images side by side, because the spaces in between the images were the true relations. And conversations matter. Question to Billie: how did you manage to pull off a commission for the American Folk Art Museum with presentation of no models, plans, sections, perspectives? Answer: we took a huge risk. We wanted to convey an idea about folk art. How can we represent a proposal without a conversation with the artists, curators, and staff? Conversations matter. Almost to the day, exactly 20 years ago, I had a conversation with Billie Tsien, an architect with such a clear trajectory of how to move forward. And the impression that she made on my architecting was lasting. We walked and talked through the formal landscape in the hardwoods of the Middle West. I was young, I was shiny, I was green, and I was honored that she wanted to know what I thought about things. She let me know that our conversation mattered to her. Our paths intersected that day at the crossroads of America, the Middle West, and I remember with clarity that conversation to this day. I remember it clearer than many of the memories that come back to me on Facebook from 5 years ago. Frankly, conversations matter. And conversations are important. No conversation is unimportant. Last night and today, we've had conversations with our community at Ball State University. I am truly grateful to Billie for that. And I trust that these conversations resonated with our students: Avery, Lauren, Ben, Megan, Antonio, Ashley, Mallory, Hal, Allison, Bryce, Joshua, Alex, Jordan, Marisha, Caitlin, Hunter, Reva, Jordan, Jake, Pranathi, Mitra, Tyler, Jason, Garrett, Drake, Zachary, Brendan, and now the College of Architecture and Planning at Ball State University. Conversations matter. In the 20 years since we last spoke, Billie has moved on with her trajectory and her clear path. She is deeply involved still with the cultural community and maintains long-lasting associations with many organizations devoted to the arts. She was director of the Public Art Fund, the Architecture League of New York. She is currently president of the Academy of Arts and Letters, a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, and has been inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters, National Academy of Design, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. In 2013, their firm was honored with the National Medal of the Arts by President Obama. Wow, conversations matter. Billie is deeply committed to making a better world through architecture, through the lens of a powerful human perspective. Certainly this is evident as the conversations matter to Billie Tsien. Please join me in welcoming to our community, Billie Tsien.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here. I feel very honored to be here. You know, lectures are always kind of funny because you show images, and all of you are now so full of images. You're seeing images all the time. But images are always a kind of fib, if not an outright lie. So everything I show you is a little bit of a lie. I was trying to think about what I remembered when people would come to speak when I was an architecture student. And it's very hard when you're first looking at so many images to even have an opinion about what is good and what is bad. In fact, I don't think you can actually have an opinion about any building unless you go to see it in real life. So I thought I would talk certainly about architecture. I'm going to talk about 4 projects. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about the space in between. Because actually that's a very, very important idea to me. And as we continue to work together in our practice, I think we become less interested in making a statement and more interested in listening, less interested in being an object and more interested in the space between objects. So this is an image of Trisha Brown, and she is a modern dancer. She just died this past year. But she did an amazing performance called If You Could See Me, and she had her back turned toward the audience the entire time. And I've always wanted to give a lecture with my back turned towards the audience. However, I'm not going to do that tonight. But I put this up because although I'm here with this microphone and I'm talking to you all, I'm actually a very shy person. And so this, there is very much a kind of desire to sort of retreat. But I have a partner, Todd Williams, who is not here tonight. And we've been married now for 35 years. And we've been working together for a few more years than that. So I always say it's like being married for 70 years because you're together day and night. But he and I are very, very different. So although I would prefer to be the shy person with the back turned, I am with somebody else who doesn't turn their back very much. But and we're very, as I said, very different, and that allows us to have the space in between. So I grew up in New Jersey. This is a picture of my mom and my younger brother, and my mom and dad immigrated from Shanghai. So I'm first generation Chinese. This is Todd and his 2 brothers, and actually his grandfather was from Indiana. So he has his Indiana and Michigan roots. So on the one hand, you could say I'm coming from the Far East, and Todd is very much a very sort of American in kind of very Midwestern grounded sense. So we had to give a lecture where we had to talk about each other. And I decided I would choose an image that represented Todd, and he would choose an image that represented me. So I chose this one, which kind of pissed him off. But he is very much a kind of action person. So the circulation that happens in our buildings and stairs, we were talking earlier today about the importance of stairs in our project. It's very much a result of Todd because he moves around a lot. He can't stay still, and he never wants to be in a room that has only one way out. So this idea of movement, I think, has a huge amount to do with who he is. And then he put this picture up to represent me. So we're a little bit back to Trisha Brown with her back turned, because this is painting by Carpaccio. And this is a study of a saint of looking out the window and contemplating sort of a vision of the death of another saint. But I am a person who loves to be still. So if Todd is the person who is always moving, I am the person who is always still. And so our architecture is trying to find that space in between movement, and stillness. So the first project that I'm showing, actually I realized, do you want those lights on? Can you see the images enough? Might be, if it's possible, it would be easier to see them if there are less lights. Although I suppose if you're filming it, it's not so good. I'll keep on talking. So this is, we were talking at lunch about competitions, and I said there's only 1 or 2 projects that we've ever won by a competition. And this project was a competition to design headquarters for the Asia Society, which is actually an American organization, but their headquarters in Hong Kong. So John D. Rockefeller founded the Asia Society to help Americans better understand Asia. So their headquarters are in New York, and then now they've started to build other headquarters in other parts of the country. So Hong Kong is a very vertical city. It is surrounded by very tall mountains, and the city is on the water. It's a very, very intense city, and felt very comfortable to me coming from New York. But the site, strangely enough, was in the midst of all of this intense sort of commercial development, but it was an abandoned British fort, and the Chinese government owned it, but it wasn't doing anything with it. So there were 3 primary buildings, and when we first went to see the site, it really looked like an Indiana Jones sort of movie, because there were banyan trees growing out of the tops of the buildings. Everything was overgrown. People were sort of living in those buildings. And in Hong Kong, you don't really buy a piece of property, you lease a piece of property. So this piece of property was given a 20-year lease, and the Asia Society decided to renovate and restore the buildings and add new buildings. So on the sketch on the far right, you can see that there were, at first, it was quite steep and very wooded. And then later on, the British made a platform, and that's what you see in the very top sketch. So they took a mountain and they created a platform, flattened it out, and that's where they put their barracks. And then later on it became overgrown, and then we worked on that platform as buildings came up around it. There are 3 existing buildings. One was, I don't know if this is going to be working. Doesn't. The very top building was for storing black powder, and we turned that into a theater. The middle building was also for munitions storage, and we turned that into a museum. And the smaller L-shaped building were a series of offices. And what's difficult to see, but you'll see in the models, is that there was a kind of stream that separated the site. And so on the lower part of the site, we've designed a new building, and we made a bridge that connected to the upper site. So on the far right, you see our competition model. And our original thought was that we would connect the upper and lower site with a straight bridge. But if you've ever been to a Chinese garden, there are often bridges that are zigging and zagging. And the reason that they say that they do that is that it prevents evil spirits from coming in. As well, there were fruit bats who were endangered, who were in some of the trees. So it seemed correct that we make this bridge to connect the 2 sites and crank the bridge. So you can see that the top 3 buildings, 2 of them have clay tile roofs, so those were all restored. And then the lower building is a modern building, and in front of it is yet another older building, all connected by a double-decker bridge. So you can see it's a very steeply wooded site, and there is this building, the glass building is the only new building. But once you pass through the new building, you enter into a kind of much more rugged and jungle feeling site. And so it becomes quite special because Hong Kong has been so tamed. And what you see is water that drops down from an upper terrace and creates a kind of waterfall so that it leaves behind the sense of the city of Hong Kong. When you walk through the doors, you hear the water falling, you hear the birds of the jungle, and then you go up the stairs to the upper level. This is the upper level, and one of the things that we said about our project when we wrote about it, we said that Hong Kong, as I said, is a very vertical city. So we wanted to make a horizontal building in a vertical city because everybody is looking down on us. And there's no way that you could make a building that would actually compete with all of the vertical buildings of Hong Kong. So by doing the opposite, you make a very, very strong statement. And our most visible elevation is really the roof because everybody around us looks down. So this is our primary elevation with the water, with the opening where the water is dropping down. And you can start to see the bridge that moves to the upper site. And this is looking towards the mountains as you're crossing the bridge. So the bridge is both a way of moving covered and uncovered because there are big monsoons in Hong Kong. And it's also a way of bringing the necessary mechanical systems from one side of the site, the lower site, to the upper site. So what you see and appears to be transparent is just the new building. So the new building has actually very little presence. It's really trying to be primarily the roof and less of a form. And on the upper level there were a series of tracks in the ground which were the tracks where they would put small sort of almost rail cars and fill them with black powder, bring them to the edge of the site, and then put them on a kind of a wire, sort of fly them down to the harbor where they would be put on top of boats. So we used the idea of a Chinese garden because they're often covered walkways and covered the tracks of the carts and used it as a way of meandering through the upper site. This is the interior of the buildings where they had offices, so offices have come back. And one of the things that we did was often in Asia, the heat and humidity in Hong Kong is very intense. And so one of the problems with trying to do restoration of old buildings is that all of the mechanical systems are put on top and willy-nilly all over the outsides of these buildings. So I show the picture on the right because there is a huge vault underneath and all the mechanical systems have been put in that huge vault. So we're really hiding those things that make these buildings habitable. So here this passageway is still continuing. A drawing that shows actually the building that became the museum, the outside of the museum. And then these great vaults, and we cut through the vaults to connect all of the chambers, but because the walls were so thick, they're 8 feet thick in granite, the temperature and humidity are remarkably steady. So we needed very little to modify the climate controls for this museum building. There are also these very big berms which were built as part of the construction so that in case the powder ignited in one of the buildings, it wouldn't catch fire and ignite all of the buildings. So what you see here is actually part of an existing military berm, and we're cutting through the berm. And then here we are back up at the very top and looking at the city. So there are the buildings that exist, but we're very interested in that space between the buildings and then the connection between the lower and upper level. This is a project that we did in Bennington, Vermont. So Bennington is a quite small private college, and they've always had a program where in the fall, which is when it's sort of mud season, winter when it's in the mud season, they send students out. And so they developed a program where they would have students do research on a particular topic, and then they would spend a semester out in the field working on this topic. They would travel to different cities. So this is called the Center for the Advancement of Public Action, and it's really a place where all of those programs are put together, and where now they bring in other people to talk about various issues that are happening in the world, mostly political, and give them a place to live, the speakers a place to live, and the students also come and listen to them speak. So we looked at a number of different sites. It's a very wooded campus, and there's, in the red, is the site that we chose. And the plan is actually very simple. And rather than making one big building, we took a kind of horizontal bar and made that a place. It's 3 separate suites where people can stay. The square building has a courtyard in the middle of it, but it is primarily a kind of large seminar room and classrooms and places where the students get together. And then a very small building on the bottom is a kind of unprogrammed building where students can plan something, where things might happen. So the relationship between the buildings, we've made the plan of the buildings very, very simple, squares and rectangles. So essentially we are able to sort of cite them in a way that they sometimes have an interesting and almost too close relationship to each other. And what that does is that it makes a place, it makes a sort of space or a courtyard between the buildings. So we were talking before about how there are stone quarries that have been abandoned here in Indiana. That was certainly true in Vermont. So at one time, Vermont had some of the largest marble quarries in the United States. And so many of the state houses across the country were built from Vermont, from marble that was quarried in Vermont. But what happened was they figured out, they really sort of, the invention of the diamond saw allowed people, stone finishers, to cut granite. Granite is much tougher than marble, so marble fell out of favor, and all of these quarries were left with big blocks of granite. So we were at a Congregationalist church in Bennington, and you can see up there are all these stones, and each stone was different, and I thought it was so beautiful, and in a certain way so much about New England, that rather than trying to be consistent or use the same stone, that it was a kind of patchwork of stones, whatever they could find. And it turns out that there was a guy who, in Rutland, who had bought all of the sort of remaindered blocks of marble. And actually, if you look in the buildings in back, those buildings are dry-laid marble buildings. So they're very much like the stones that you see in the pathway. It's whatever marble they found, they dry-laid it and used it as sort of storage sheds in the marble yards. So this guy had all of these different pieces of marble, some of them quarried 100, 150 years ago. And it was a kind of amazing boneyard of stone, and what they were being used for now was he was making tombstones for Arlington. And so it was a kind of great find, and we decided that this is the stone that we would use for our building. So the 3 buildings are clad in variegated marble from Vermont. So when I was talking today to the students, I was talking about trying to make buildings feel very much a part of the place, and that certainly has to do with material. And I understand in the school you're doing sort of material forward studies, where you're sort of going to fabricators, going to places where materials come from, and understanding their qualities. Because as Todd says, you get the best vegetables when you go to the farmer. And so we try always in all of our projects to go to places where materials are coming from. And all of the buildings, the land is sloping, but the roof is at one consistent level, because we wanted to make it feel, it's pretentious, but in the sort of way like an acropolis. So it crowns the top of the hill, and they have a very strong horizontal relationship to each other. And so then I was saying that the buildings are skewed to each other, but it's really to start to form that space in between. And you can see in the far building, there's actually a cut through the building because we wanted people both to walk through the courtyard, but through the building and up to the buildings behind. So we're also part of a larger structure. We're not simply a thing unto itself. So, this is the surgical chamber, and also at the United Nations. And how do people talk to each other? And so we looked at this room, much smaller version, but it's a tiered room with a table at the center. So whether they're talking about issues of mass incarceration, water, food deserts, people will come and they'll sit at the table, and students will sit around the edges and they'll have discussions. And then the center courtyard we saw as another room. Although it's cold in Vermont, when you cut off the wind and just are sitting there underneath the sun, it becomes a place that you can gather as well in the wintertime as well as in the summertime. And at first we thought that the windows should all be clear so that one could look into the courtyard. And then we realized it wasn't a room if the windows were all clear. So the windows are all frosted. So it gives a glow when you're inside, but it also gives you a sense of being enclosed when you're in the courtyard. And then here the rooms, it was fun because we were sort of designing each room as if it were sort of private bedroom. And here you can actually see that one of the pieces of stone we used has these sort of washboard markings on it. And we decided we were going to take what we called picture stones and simply cut the slab and take the face of the slab and put it up, sometimes to show the marking of how the stone was cut, sometimes to show the marking of how it was beginning to be fabricated, sometimes to show age. So the interior, I said, each one is different. We used a cabinet maker from Brooklyn, and this tile was done by an artist who had gone to Pennington, and tried to make it a kind of amazing and special place for the people who come to give talks there and lectures. And then in this final unprogrammed space, since the whole idea was trying to have students develop their own curriculum, we thought we would give them a place where they could program it themselves. So this is, and it is a kind of continuing interest of ours, of how you bring in light from the ceiling. So it is a building within a kind of shape, and the shape goes up to a small opening in the ceiling, and that opens to the sky to change the light. This is a project that's actually under construction, and so we're still in the midst of it. But it's at the Exeter campus, and anybody who knows the Exeter campus knows that Kahn did the Exeter Library, and so the circle is the Exeter Library. And a kind of odd thing when you look at the site plan is that you see it's sort of slightly skewed. It's not in relationship to the rest of the buildings on the campus. And not that we wanted to actually try to copy, but we are very aware of Kahn. Our building is skewed for slightly different reasons and is also square for a number of different reasons. The primary reason being that it had a huge program. So this has got a main performance theater, a small, essentially sort of thrust stage, a black box, a dance performance theater, backup house, shop. And Exeter had worked with a theater consultant, and they've determined that they needed all of these things, but they had a very, very tight budget. So when you put everything together, this was kind of on the far right was the theater consultant's massing study, which basically was throwing a sheet over all the pieces. And this is our massing study, because what we realized is it's like the story where you have the box and you have to put the big rocks into the box first, and then you put the smaller rocks, and then you put the sand. We had to put the big rocks in the box, and if we had to make it, this is a $34 million project, so we had to make all of these big rocks fit into the box, and the box had to be as tight as possible, because that was the most efficient way of bringing in all the program at once. And so we talked about this box as being like a geode. So the outside is extremely plain and very, very solid. Theaters actually don't want windows into them. But inside, when you cracked it open, it would be sort of full of life. And the other image that we talked about was this sort of drawing of a beehive. And often we try to locate a kind of image or thought. We keep on going back, geode, beehive, geode, beehive. And it helps us to stay true to a kind of original direction of a project. And so the section shows that everything is sort of crammed in as tightly as possible. So here's the building in a rendering. It's a very, very simple box. The only thing that rises above it is a bit of the fly tower. And it is turned because it is now welcoming people. On the other side of this road are all the academic buildings. And the far side of the road is where all of the athletic spaces used to be. So there's a huge gym. There's tennis courts, baseball fields, and their football stadium. And so in part of our planning, we closed the road that was in between our building and the gym building, which is to the right, and tried to see this as a gateway. So the building turns because it's trying to open up and say, this is the other side of the campus, and we're welcoming you to the other side of the campus. At the same time, we're connecting you to the other side of the campus, because those people who are primarily doing athletics would cross over, but those people who are doing theater were mostly on the other side. So we're trying to knit together this sense of the campus. So it's a little hard to see, but there are only windows on the social spaces on the ground floor, and then there's a very big opening. And we like to make openings that are ceremonial, and if you looked at the images of the Barnes Foundation, you saw that there's a very big opening, actually with a quite small door. This is a very big opening, but we took in this idea of a curtain, a red curtain. So the school is in New England, and in many ways it embodies a kind of New England sense of austerity. But at the same time, it's theater. So we wanted to signal that this is a place where magic happens when you go through the door. So this red curtain will be made out of the same brick, but glazed in very bright sort of vermilion and saffron colors. So this is a drawing that shows the curtain. It shows the different kinds of brick and the color of each brick. And then we went to Denmark, because that's where the farmer was. I mean, that's where the bricks were made. And they both made the gray bricks, but they also glazed the bricks there. So this particular guy is from Germany. He came over and he showed them how to glaze the bricks. So the curtain will be made out of these bricks with the very large ones on the edge of the curtain to give that sense of drama as you walk into this building. So this is a little confusing as an image, but on the far right you're looking at a Congregationalist church, a church in New England, so it's very upright and proper, white beadboard. And on this is one of those prison pictures of Piranesi. So when we put all the big rocks into the box, it fills up almost all the space, but there's a tiny bit of space left in between. And so we thought that that would be the dramatic space. And so these images show, on one side, on this image, there are dance studios on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side is the form of the big theater. So this, the circulation space is in between the big program elements. And here you can see in red the primary circulation spaces on each floor. But you can see that the majority of the building is taken up by the program. But we're trying to make each floor, the circulation space, different. So it's not simply corridor on top of corridor, but each time it's a sort of journey. We also thought a lot about how do we bring that sense of theater into the interior of the building. And we've been working a lot with a person who does commercial felt. So these are dance costumes by a designer named Leon Bakst for the Ballet Russe. And so these are drawings that were done in the 20s for these sort of amazing costumes. So we're looking at these drawings and looking at the sense of flowing cloth and using that as a kind of basis for the design of the felt that will go in some of the public spaces. I said there are two big windows where you could sort of look in. So we're going to line those spaces with this felt based on the sort of fabric designs. And so it's a bright sort of fuchsia and a kind of saffron color. And this is us in our studio, and we're looking at samples that have come in. These were a little muddy, so we're brightening them up and sending them back, and then these are applied to the wall like wallpaper. So that's that sort of squish space in between one theater and the other theater and dance spaces, and you can start to see how the felt will enliven that space. And then the other walls are actually beadboard, so they're going to be that white painted vertical boards. So this is the last project that I'm going to show, and then I'm going to show an installation that we did in Venice. This is for us a kind of project of a lifetime, as you might imagine. And it's a huge honor and a huge responsibility, and we're definitely bearing the weight of it. I don't know if we can live up to what we hope to live up to. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the things, the ideas we were thinking about when we presented. So this is a picture that we just took in our studio. And one of the things that's very important about this new presidential center is that it's not really a standard archive or library. So the papers will be digitized and kept elsewhere. And not on site. And the space will be, that would have been the archives is going to be Chicago Public Library. But the most important thing is that this is a place where people from all over the world, probably primarily young people, but nationally, locally, globally, will come to learn about civics. And it will teach people to be active citizens in the world. And so what President and Mrs. Obama say is that, of course, people will come to see their story, but it's not really their story, it's everybody's story. So we're trying to talk about what do you do to talk about everybody's story? And so this idea of a sort of tower which has a sense of holding many people's stories was important to us. So when we talk about this project, we actually show some of the images that we showed when we were trying to present the idea. And we said, well, there are two words. And so if our words for Exeter, or geode and beehive, we kept on going back to these words, enable and ennoble. And so, he looks so young there. He is in Chicago, and he's organizing, and he was enabling people to be active citizens. And then of course, that's the inauguration. And he himself was ennobled as a president, but his presidency ennobled, I think, our democracy. So these two words, enable and ennoble, and they go back and forth because you enable people and then you ennoble them at the same time. So they're very, very linked for us. We also talked about, and this is before we had any design, we said that this is a place that is very much, and presidential libraries, the traditional ones, have been very much about storytelling. It's about the 4 years or the 8 years of the presidency and what happened. So you're telling a story, and the story is important. But more importantly also here, it's about story making. So we said, it's a balance between those two. So the site is in a park, and we felt once again that it would be better, rather than having a big building, it would be better to break up the building. So it was important to make something that felt like a landmark, that saluted that sense of many people's stories. But at the same time, it was for us important to break it up so that within the park there would be the ability to walk through the presidential center and to the park. So the site, if you can see it, is outlined in red. It's Jackson Park on the south side of Chicago. The building with a light green roof is the Museum of Science and Industry. And actually this whole site, including the lagoons, which were essentially artificial, was all part of the Chicago World's Fair, the World Exposition. And so our site was actually where the horticultural buildings were. So it was a very, at one time, a very built site, and then there was a great fire. Everything burned down. Not the Museum of Science and Industry, which was had another name, but was masonry building, so that remained. One of the things that we're doing, and is taking a very long time, is that over the course of time, what was a carriage path, and you see it says Cornell Drive up there, had become a 6-lane, very, very busy road, which essentially cut the park from the neighborhood because you couldn't walk through to the water without crossing Cornell. And it's very, very, at certain times of the day, extremely active. So one of the first things we did, we said that we believed that Cornell Drive should be removed. So that's taking a long time to go through its various approval processes. And this is a hard image to see. We're working with Michael Van Valkenburg, but we're bringing the earth over the top of 2 of the buildings so that you see that there is a kind of building that's the museum tower that is on the far right, but the other 2 buildings have earth coming up over the top of them. And we did something similar in a project at Prospect Park where we brought the earth on top. So you can be running or walking on a pathway in the park and find yourself on top of the building. So 2 things were very important to us, that you connect the park all the way through, and that the park in many ways covers the presence of the building. So this is an earlier image of a model. We're still developing it. We just finished schematic design, so we have a long way to go. But here you can see that there's a building. The more solid part of it in the middle is where 4 floors of museum are. The top is a public space. It will be a viewing space for people. You don't have to pay money to go in there. And this idea of a kind of web of words, because he is a president who believed in the power of words and who used words, is there as a kind of sunscreen. And then incised words, it's a little difficult to see, as a kind of bas-relief on that tower. But this is what you would see from the sort of first window in the tower. So you're looking down into public courtyard and across to the public library, and you can see that there are plants. There will be a productive garden growing on top of the library. There'll be a teaching kitchen, broadcast studios to teach people to broadcast, and mostly classrooms. So there'll be many classes that will be going on. And here in the yellow, we're just showing all of the spaces are unticketed and open to the public. So in many ways, it's a kind of very, very large community center, with the purple being ticketed because that will be the museum section. So I've been talking about the space between, and I think one of the really difficult, this is sort of the most difficult time that I can remember about the difficulties with space between people. So I thought that I wanted to talk a little bit about what is common ground. And a few years ago, David Chipperfield was the commissioner for the Venice Biennale, and his theme was called Common Ground. And I thought it was a very beautiful thing. What is it that unites us? And so many of you know the site for the Biennale. The Arsenale is a very, very long building where most of the installations are installed. But we decided that we didn't want to be in the Arsenale because the scale is so huge. And so we asked to be in this small garden, which is really towards the back. And we located a small shed, which was where they stored the seeds and gardening tools. And it was called Casa Scappali. And what we thought about were sort of boxes of wonderment, I guess you could say. We thought we would ask friends some of whom were architects, some of whom were writers, artists, what are the things that inspire them? What are the things that give them joy? And we were interested in seeing whether there was a kind of common ground. Do those things that give us joy, are they the things that we share with other people? So we asked about 40 people, and we sent them a box. And this is our site, which was actually quite hidden because vines had covered it. So we also liked that our box was somewhat of a mystery and was also a sort of box of wonder. And in true Venetian style, they said that all the boxes would be unpacked when we got there and all set up. And then 2 days before the opening, we got there and they were all underneath this pink plastic. So we luckily had our cabinet maker with us, and he was the one who made all the boxes. So this is Stephen Eno in his wood shop. And he was there, and our son was there. So there's Stephen, me, and our son. And we opened up all the boxes, and it was an incredible gift to see what people had done and what they had sent and what are the things that inspired them. So I thought I would just show you a few of those boxes, what was inside. So the wooden one is by Brad Clopeful. It's all pieces of turned wood because he is, I think, thinking of the Pacific Northwest. The one that you see with the bread is a sort of double box, and that was made by an amazing man who you should probably have come talk with you, called Johanne Palasma, if you don't know him already. And then Stephen Holes is down in the bottom. And I found this picture, and it was not in our, it was on Flickr or something, and I looked at it, and there were 2 people who used to work in our office standing there, so it was kind of wonderful to sort of find friends there as well. So each box, people were allowed to fill however they wanted to fill. This one was made by our cabinet maker, Stephen Eno. So he made the box, and then he put inside things that were important to him. So one of them was the plumb bob to make sure that things are straight. This is by Glenn Murcutt and Wendy Lewin. So they included 2 hats, golden dunce caps that they wore when they got married, which I thought was quite wonderful. And here's Johanni in Finland putting in his objects. So he wanted to put in some bread from Finnish bread, a movie by Tarkovsky. And I think somewhere in there are all of his past passports. So these are all things that are kind of talismans. So this is Max Goggin and Merrill Elam. And they sent this picture and these things in the boxes. So Merrill made a feather cape that she's wearing. And Max sent the pants that he used to go motorcycle racing in, red leather pants. And the studio made the legs to go either underneath the cape or inside the pants. So we opened that one up, and that's what we found, which was pretty crazy. It's Toyo Ito, and he sent boxes, rocks that were rubble from the tsunami. And people wrote on the rocks. This is Claudia Youngstra, who is a great friend and a textile artist, and she has her own sheep and dyes her own wool using natural materials. So here she's using onion skins to dye her wool, and she made these and called them Dreaming. Of this special piece herself. She's a kind of crazy woman. That was her inside a mask. As I said before, Stephen Hole, so he put some of his favorite books and then models of his buildings stretched so that we couldn't see them because we made the rule that you couldn't show work. And then this is our son and his business partner making their box because we asked him to make a box. And what they did was they took the box that we sent them and they took it apart and carved it up and made it into a little teeny tiny box and filled it with an 8-ball. And the 8-ball they filled with water from the canals in Venice. So Todd said he thought it was somehow edible, but I said I think it was just being creative. And then this last image is also an image of hands. I think that even as I talk about the importance of difference and how we can celebrate the space apart in common ground, I think we also need to find a way where we can take that space and join our hands together. Because as I said to the students today, as architects, we have a huge gift. We've been given a huge gift because so many people spend their lives and there's nothing sort of physical to show for it in the end. So our gift is we have the possibility of making something real that people can touch, feel, smell, and inhabit. But that's also a huge responsibility. So I think that we need to honor that responsibility and join hands with other people and try to understand how we can make this world truly a better place. So thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. If you have a question, please come down here to the front of the stage and I'll hand the mic over. If you have a second question, you can get in line and form a line up the stairs.
Hi, my name is Roberto Medina, and I'm a CAP student. And I was talking to Malcolm Cairns, he's one of my professors, and he was talking about your office and Central Park. And I just want to know, like, how does having like a front row seat to like the community in New York City, how does that influence your work?
It's like dueling microphones. You're incredibly lucky. I mean, where we are, we get to see everybody walking past, which is really quite wonderful. All the demonstrations come right past our door. The marathon comes right past our door. So we see kind of amazing things. But we see it against the background of Central Park because we're right on the edge of Central Park. So I think we feel it's great to be on the ground floor because we feel very, very connected to the city in a very direct way. And in a certain way, probably people end up looking at us more than we end up looking at them, though. Because we're quite an odd group of people sitting on the ground floor. Nobody can actually figure out what we're doing.
Thank you.
Okay, who's next?
I want to thank you again for your amazing lecture and for coming here to Ball State to visit with us and for sitting down this morning to have a very nice, intimate conversation as well. One of the things that I think I've seen come out in your work today as you've talked about it is issues of representation, not only about how you're choosing to represent yourself and the work that you talk about, but then also how you are confronting the notion of like who is the architect truly responsible for, and who are we responsible for representing in that way. And I wonder, more generally, I think a lot of people here in this college and broadly think about architecture as this kind of practice of health, safety, and welfare. Sounds like we're going to get some feedback here in a couple seconds from the microphones. But from that, this question of like, what is like the moral responsibility of architects to the community, and these notions of representation that you seem to be battling with, how are you situating those, especially in today's context that, as you mentioned yourself, has become especially hard to find common ground in?
So I understand that you're leaving architecture and going into philosophy. So you're asking me about the moral responsibility towards beauty. Do we have a moral responsibility towards beauty? Is that what you're asking?
To clarify, I'm actually leaving architecture for anthropology.
Oh, anthropology.
That's all right. I'm an architecture and philosophy student, and I'm moving on to begin a doctoral program at Yale for anthropology. But the question that I have more specifically is it's a little bit more political, because I think that Kevin definitely has elucidated the moral question that beauty raises for us, but it's also, I guess, about your own perspective about like beyond like the express, kind of thing that we're given about health, safety, and welfare that like the law and code gives us. How are we supposed to take that role we've been given to kind of solidify our own legacy and like become like I don't know. Is this a question? This is not a very well phrased question. Is what this question is. But I think I don't know. I think you've kind of done a very good job today about like talking about these issues of representation in a way which feels expansive, and it seems like you're talking about all of these other cross-cutting issues about the moral responsibility that you see to beauty and these other things. And I'm wondering, like, how is this all being situated for you? Because these seem like such very diverse issues about like representation and our responsibility to the community and this need for involvement and for creating spaces that like ennoble and enable people and all of these other things. And I'm wondering, like, what is that? how are you seeing that like spectrum of moral responsibility related? Is it something which is inherent to the architect? Is it something which you're bringing to it?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that Todd always has said, especially when you're a young architect, it's easier to know what you don't want to do than what you want to do. And that may be true in life also. And in that way, you start to make choices about who you are and what you believe in. And, you know, we also talked today about constraints and how constraints are really, really helpful. So I think it's important to understand what, even before what you say yes to and what you believe in, what you say no to and what you think is wrong. And then that's how I think we start to think about our practice. So it's less about I must do what low-cost housing, I must do shelter for emergencies, for us, it's more that there's certain kinds of work that we feel that we don't want to do, and then that leads us in a sort of direction. And I would say that you talked, Kevin, about a kind of maybe a clear path. I would say that we have never had a sort of clear path, but we just knew where we didn't want to go. And so I'm sort of turning the question around, because rather than sort of necessarily affirming a kind of belief system, you look at things and you say, no, this is not for me. And then that helps you over the years, and it's been many years, to try to then affirm a belief system which then informs the kind of work that you do, the kind of work that you want to do. You know, I think also, and this is not the way everybody should be, because I don't believe that I'm prescribing this for all architects, but for us, our architecture is so intertwined with our lives, being married to each other, that it's not really a business. It's a business in that we have to make money, we have to pay everybody, but it's not really why we do it. So those decisions that some people need to make based on business are also things that we're sort of, they're not in that sort of, they're not the things that push us forward.
You kind of touched on it on the last question, but I believe you're quoted as saying that you should work for someone whose work that you respect, and I imagine you're married to someone whose work you respect, so how do you think that's influenced your design and how you see things?
Okay, this is a slightly weird thing, because I do believe that you should work for people that you respect. However, I got out of architecture school and I went to work for Todd. So I've only really worked for one person, and then eventually we became partners. So I would say I deeply believe in this person who, you know, is also my partner and husband. But I also believe that when you, as a young architect, when you work so hard, because you all work so hard, that you want to be doing work, where you feel like you can learn, and where you believe in the work that's being done, because otherwise how can you put your heart into it? And you're always being asked to put your heart into it.
It was a pleasure today, and I wanted to ask about your thoughts regarding our interest in our programs in social and environmental justice, because we're just getting started. We have our first graduates in architecture coming out this year. We had a few last year. This is our first full year, and we're still building it, and we'd love to hear your thoughts about the things that we should take in consideration as we move forward.
Well, I also enjoyed our lunch today and our talking. I think, an incredibly important program. The ACSA conference was just on architecture and ethics. So I think both it is clearly a hot topic in many ways in how we practice and also what we practice, but I think it's a very, very necessary one. So even when it's no longer the hot topic, it is a hot topic. I think that it was interesting today and I'm going to sort of reiterate, and I'm sorry I'm saying this again because we talked in smaller groups, but in the thesis group, there's a young woman who's doing, I don't see you, but I know you're there probably somewhere, School for Blind Children. And I sort of reiterated the story of a close friend who's actually a friend of some people here who had always been profoundly deaf. And I know this is rambling, but I'm going to get to the point. She had an operation, a cochlear implant, which suddenly allowed her to hear. And she said for the first few months it was terrible. It's not wonderful to hear when you haven't heard before. It's incredibly chaotic and distracting, and she couldn't think, and she felt like she was going to go crazy. And she almost wished, she could undo what was happening. And it made me think about this young woman who is designing this facility for blind children and coming from the point of a sighted person who then says, oh, this is a terrible condition and that we need to make it better because it's not a good condition. But maybe that's not actually what a blind child feels or sees. And maybe it's a sort of wonderful condition and we're only trying to sort of impose our sort of standards, our condition on top of someone else. And so I think a true understanding of a kind of social inequality, which is not based on a kind of outside view of imposing what we think is the right thing to do for other people in their communities, is a profound need in our profession. And that's why I think it's an incredibly important program. So I told you I'd come back. I'm back. You're welcome.
Billie, thank you very much. Go back in.